Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Ponderosa Life. My name is Bonnie, and this is my beautiful horse, Catalina. I am cleaning her tail today because her tail is very, very, very dirty, and it needed to be cleaned really, really badly. It was a nice January day, enough to where the cold water wasn't going to bother her by me brushing her, or washing out her tail. So today is Story Sunday, and I am going to continue talking about the true story of the Little House on the Prairie. The first story that I did for the Little House on the Prairie, I will link in the description below. If any of you haven't listened to it and would like to hear it, you can click on the link and listen to it. It is the beginning of when Ma and Pa first met, got married, and had all of their children, and ended with them moving to D. Smith's, South Dakota, when Pa went to work for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company, and Ma and the girls took their own trip there after Pa set up a new home near Silver Lake. It was an old surveyor's house, and that was in 1879. So they got there, they set up a homestead near, I think the book is called On the Banks of Silver Lake. Laura talks about how they lived in a shacky? Not really sure. I think it's just like a really simply put together home. There's nothing really fancy about it. And that was going to be the start of their homestead outside of town. They started a garden. Pa started wheat and corn and grew hay, and I think they had some cows. Well, they had a cow, I think, and some chickens, and they were starting their homestead life. They were starting to build the life that Pa had dreamt of for so long. So during that spring and summer, they were growing their garden, and by fall, the family's garden yielded a more satisfying but still scarce harvest. They were able to get 5 sacks of potatoes, lots and lots of turnips, which were Carrie's favorite, 6 ripe pumpkins and a bunch of green pumpkins, and then nearly a bushel of beans, 10 stalks of corn, and enough tomatoes to make a gallon of sweet preserves, which I am not sure what that is. And then they made about 2 quarts of green tomato pickles. So I guess tomatoes were the choice of making pickles before cucumbers. Or maybe they just weren't able to get any cucumbers, and so they used the pickles, the tomatoes instead. But anyway, that is what they were able to harvest before the devastating, the mother of all winters, and to this day, they experienced the earliest blizzard in their area of all times, well, since 1880. So, in 1880, there was a blizzard that went on and on and on. And I'm going to start by telling you about the blizzard. So the family is living in this little, what they called shacky. And the last story that I told, also I said and talked about how Mary had gone blind. So Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace are all living out in this place. And Laura is helping Mary out a lot because Mary is blind. It did say that one of the things Mary was happy about was that she was able to wash the dishes and make the bed almost as well as Laura, even though she was blind. So anyway, they were out living on the homestead. Fall was a beautiful fall. There wasn't anything devastating or weird about fall. They actually said that the weather was on the warm side. Pa had noticed the muskrats were building the walls in their den really, really thick, and he had actually told Laura that that must be a sign that it's going to be a bad winter. And so, anyway, Pa said he had this feeling to be in a hurry. And so he was doing the best he could to bring in the hay and the corn and the wheat. And so, anyway, October 15th started off with light rain, and then the wind shifted, and they got a blinding rain, which was followed by sleet and ice. Soon, the snow began. The snow was so thick, they said that you could not see 10 feet in front of you. I can remember reading in the long winter that Laura talked about being let out of school early, and they were barely able to see in front of her to make it home. And she wrote about how she held Carrie's hand so they wouldn't get separated by the wind, because the wind was blowing so hard. And her fear was that if they got separated by being blown apart from the wind, they wouldn't be able to find each other again and they would get lost in the snow. But they did make it home. But the snow did not stop for 3 days. The 3 days of snow actually stopped the train, no pun intended, in its track. Like, there was the sleet and the ice, and then there was the snow. And the train could not get down the track, so the train was stopped. And the train was the only way for supplies to get into the town and to everybody that lived out in basically the frontier of the United States at the time. In fact, at this time, it was called the Dakota Territory. So there wasn't even a North or South Dakota, which I'll get into that later. So this was just the Dakota Territory is what it was called at the time. Anyway, Laura wrote that after the 3 days of endless snow, she walked into town to buy flour and coal, only to discover that when she got there, the merchants didn't have any. They were actually waiting for the train to resupply the store. So anyway, this is how the devastation and survival began for the winter. Well, it wasn't even winter yet. It was still fall, October. So anyway, settlers, just like Pa Ingalls, they went out to try to find their cows. And when they went to go find them, they discovered that the cows had actually either gotten lost and they couldn't find them. And then the cows they could find, they were literally suffocating in the snow. Some of the cows were actually hit by the train because the train conductors couldn't see them past the snow. And I'm sure the cows were disoriented and didn't even realize that they were walking on the tracks. Also, the settlers harvesting their hay and their wheat, they were in the middle of harvesting them, and they didn't have time to actually take their wheat to a mill to get ground or grinded into flour before the blizzard came. So all of the settlers and stuff, they literally were left with just wheat berries and not flour. And so a lot of the people in the area did not prepare for winter because they felt like they had so much time to get ready because they were having such a mild fall. Also, they didn't have any coal for their fire because they didn't think they had to get ready for winter yet. And as far as I know, which I don't know a lot about the area as far as what grows there and stuff, but I don't think there's a lot of forest in the Dakotas. So you couldn't just go out and cut down a tree and bring in, the tree to burn. So they relied on coal. And most of the settlers, including the Ingalls, didn't have any for this winter. So somewhere, which I wasn't able to find the exact time of the blizzards, but somewhere along the way, the Ingalls moved back into town to go through this winter, because I guess they knew how bad it was going to get because the snow was not letting up. And they ended up moving back into town. Also, the other thing that I read was that the girls didn't end up going back to school after the blizzards because it was just too hard to get from the schoolhouse back to the house because you couldn't see in the snow and the chances of getting lost were very, very high. So Laura wrote in her book that school was canceled, but then there were like other things that I found out where it said that the school wasn't canceled and that the teacher of the school actually took attendance. So I don't know if it was just the Ingalls family, and I'm sure not just the Ingalls family, chose not to go to school because of the weather, or maybe it was Mom and Pa that didn't want the girls to go to school because of the hazards of getting home. So they just told the girls that school was canceled for the duration of the blizzards. I'm not really sure. But the girls ended up staying home. They didn't go back to school after the blizzards had started. So they moved back into town, and the only way to provide fire, which obviously it's blizzarding, right? I mean, there's snow everywhere. It's very, very cold. Everybody, the Ingalls family and the other settlers, because they didn't have any coal, they took the hay that they had harvested and they twisted it very, very tightly and wound it together to make these hay logs. And then they would burn the hay logs for fire. And they said that it burnt very, very quickly and it didn't produce a lot of heat, but it was better than nothing. And Laura actually helped Pa do a lot of these hay logs where she would go out and help him twist all of this hay together to make these hay logs so that Ma could cook and they could at least get a little bit of heat in the house that they were living in. So by the time December came around, it was still blizzarding. So we have 3 solid months of snow. It was a lot of hard work to make the hay logs to stay alive, and I'm sure that the little bit of food that the Ingalls had stocked up was being rationed, but it was still running very, very low by this time. Pa had asked Ma if she could take the wheat berries and grind them somehow to turn them into some sort of flour. And Ma said, yes, she could do that, but the only thing that she had to grind the wheat berries with was a coffee grinder. And a coffee grinder is very, very small. And she said in order to make enough flour to make bread, they would constantly have to be grinding the wheat berries in the coffee grinder. And so that's what happened. They ended up putting the berries in and just grinding all day to get enough flour to make a loaf of what they called brown bread for everybody to eat. So December is the month of Christmas, and unfortunately, the December of 1880 was not a happy Christmas. It was still blizzarding, it was still cold, food was running very, very, very scarce. And the wheat berry supply that they had was getting smaller and smaller. So the new year comes and the blizzards still have not stopped. So now we are in 1881. It got so bad that Laura wrote about how instead of getting up and doing their normal routine, which was very important to Ma, that they kept their regular schedule of getting up, getting dressed, doing your chores, even though there wasn't very many chores to come up with, doing your sewing and everything else, because she said it was important to have a good spirit, even in tough times. They eventually just stopped getting up and they stayed in bed. because they were so hungry and they were so cold that staying in bed was better than getting up and thinking about how miserable you were all the time. So then February comes and the blizzards are still coming. It does not look like the blizzards are going to stop at all. So across the street, or somewhere in town, there were two gentlemen and their sister living somewhere in town. I'm not quite sure exactly where, but Paul had known them, and they were the Wilder family. It was two brothers and a sister, and I don't remember what the sister's name is, and unfortunately I don't remember the brother's name either. But I do remember the most important brother, and that was L'Ormanzo. And so Paul ended up going over to them and talking to them, and I'm sure there was a lot of times where men got together to try to figure out what were they going to do to help keep their families from starving to death. And so he went over and he was talking to L'Ormanzo and his brother, and they were two bachelors, and they came up with a plan to try to go back out to the homesteading land where people were growing the wheat and stuff. And so that was a plan that L'Ormanzo Wilder and his brother were going to work on. So, and still, they're getting blizzards. Blizzards after blizzards after blizzards, and still no train. The train cannot come down the track. And so it's got to be getting very desperate by now. There's no radio stations, there's no TV, there's no weatherman, that are going to tell you how much longer you have to endure. And they've already endured 6 months, a half of year of blizzards, non-stop, over and over and over. And so I can only imagine the mindset you must have when you have no idea if it's ever going to end, and then knowing that you're hungry and you're cold. So fortunately, L'Ormanzo and Cape Garland was able to buy wheat, and they were able to get enough wheat berries to bring back into town to at least help people be able to eat a little bit more. Then, finally, after their health was failing and people were getting really, really skinny, they were getting to the point to where they were nearly starving to death. April 27th, 1881, the blizzards ended. So from October 15th to April 27th, the next year, 7 months, the history, the people that study weather and stuff said that between October and April, there were only 12 days where it did not snow. That's insane. But anyway, finally the snow started to melt, which meant the most amazing thing. The train was able to get to town on May 5th, 1881, and deliver food and supplies. And it was like Christmas. So much so that the entire town had a late Christmas dinner together. And so they had a large gathering, and they all celebrated and cooked and probably made gifts for each other and everything else, whatever they could do, because this was definitely a time to celebrate, knowing that it was over, and that even though they were faced with the melting snow, which meant another problem, there was a lot of flooding, at least it wasn't rain. At least it wasn't snow. They weren't getting snowed in, and the train was still able to come in and out and deliver supplies. So that was a struggle, and I couldn't imagine going through it. I mean, we all go through things, and just these past couple of years, we went through something that had never happened in my history of life, and it seemed difficult and uncertain and everything else, but it would be nothing compared to facing a blizzard that lasted 7 months. That would be insane. So after the blizzard and everything calmed down, it seems somewhere in there, Paul had decided to stay and make a store in the building that they were living in during the long winter. So he became a store owner. And the family lived upstairs above the store. And so life started going on and being normal again. And so then there was Mary. Mary is the sister that's blind. And Paul had become concerned for Mary and how she was going to be able to live as a blind person in the most normal way that she could. So he started searching out, trying to figure out how Mary could get help. And he found a man that was an attorney to help him. And the man's name was Vinster V. Barnes. I'm just going to call him Mr. Barnes because, yeah, I don't know how to say his first name. But anyway, he told Paul about a college in Iowa that was a college for the blind. But Paul told Mr. Barnes that they didn't have any money to send Mary. So Mr. Barnes went to work and wrote a letter to George Hann, the Secretary of the Dakota Territory, the summer of 1881, and the attorney, Mr. Barnes, had described Mary as, quote, a young and intelligent lady who ought to be provided for in some way. Her parents are unable to make much provision for either her treatment or her mental culture. I thought that was, end quote. I thought culture was an interesting word to use for mental health. So Mr. Hann, the Secretary of the Dakota Territories, he responded by letting them know that the Territory Council had passed a legislation in 1879, so when the family moved to DeMint, South Dakota, that authorized the government of the territory to enter a contract of 5 years of time with an institution in the surrounding states, which was Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska, to provide education to blind residents, quote, keeping in view economy, end quote, as well as the welfare of the student. So in 1881, the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton charged $216 per out-of-state student a year, which is roughly $3,000 in today's money. So now another gentleman, Amos Whitting, the superintendent of the school, began the necessary paperwork for Mary, who was 16 at this time. So she went blind when she was 14, so now she's 16. And Mr. Barnes, the attorney that Paul went to work he was trying to get additional funds for traveling expenses, hoping that Mom and Paul would be able to go with Mary. And he wrote, quote, the young lady has been blind only a short while and not long enough to learn to help herself. She is, in fact, at the present left almost helpless, and it will be necessary for her parents to attend her, end quote. So records don't show if they got the extra funds, but on October 15th, 1881, I find that funny because that's exactly 1 year to the day of the first blizzard the year before, Mary was approved by the governor of Dakota to go to the college for 5 years. It's said that she actually carried the signed documents with her to Vinton, the College for the Blind in Iowa, when she arrived 1 month later on November 23rd, 1881. Mary would be there for about 2 years before returning home for the first time, and Laura wrote about how Mary moved around so, quote, gay and confident, end quote. Laura went on to tell how Mary was able to sew, open things, do patchwork, walk around town with ease, and I can only imagine how amazing it must have been for the family to see her being able to act like a normal person and not realizing, when you looked at her, when you saw her doing the things that she was doing as a blind person. Because when she left, she was needing help with everything almost. So Pa ended up buying Mary an organ, and Mary had learned to play it beautifully. Mary continued to go to the Iowa College for the Blind until 1889, which means she went for 2 extra years than the original application, because in 1885 the law changed and said that the students were allowed to go for 8 years. And Mary wanted to continue, but in 1889 the Dakota territories began to be North and South Dakota. So this is where I learned that they were separated. And South Dakota took a different approach for the blind citizens. And in 1892, the Iowa College for the Blind told Mary, quote, it would be impossible because South Dakota had appropriated no money for the education of the blind, end quote. So Mary was not able to continue going to the college that she obviously loved very much and was very beneficial for her, because South Dakota, they didn't put any money aside for it. So, and Mom and Pa still couldn't afford to pay for the college for her to go to. So that was the end of Mary's education at the College for the Blind, and she moved in with Ma and Pa. So now I'm going to go back a couple of years before Mary graduated. So in 1886, Pa filed paperwork to put decoration on the homestead that they had been working on before they moved into town. And it was about 150 acres of land, and it cost Ma and Pa $16 for the filing fee, and it became their homestead. So starting in December of that year, Laura received her teacher's certificate, and she began to teach school. She got a contract for 2 months in a town that was about 12 miles from where Ma and Pa's homestead was. And Laura wrote in her book about how miserable of a wife the family where she boarded with when she was a teacher was. She said that she never took care of her crying baby, and she was very mean to her husband, and they argued all the time. And it made Laura realize how much love there was in her actual family, that, sometimes but until you see it from a different point of view, you're like, oh, wow. My Ma and Pa really love each other, because Ma would never do this to Pa. So anyway, she had to live with these people while she was teaching the school, and she was just absolutely miserable. Well, you remember Lormonzo Wilder, the one that helped get the wheat berries with his brother to save the town? Well, he offered to bring Laura home for the weekends and take her back to the boarding house, just so that she could have a little bit of a break in between teaching school and staying in the boarding house. And of course, she was very thankful for this. And Lermanzo was very happy that she took his offer because, as I said earlier in the story, Lermanzo was a bachelor and he had his eye on Laura. A little bit of a spoiler, he becomes Laura's future husband. But this was before they were dating, and it was a 24-mile round trip for him to take her from the boarding house to home, and then from home back to the boarding house. And then, of course, he would have to go back to his homestead. So, all I gotta say is, good move, mans. Good move. Anyway, Laura wrote about their sleigh rides in her book, These Happy Golden Years. She talked about how they were very cold and how Lermanzo had to keep her from falling asleep because if you went to sleep, you were more likely to freeze to death. Like you would fall asleep and you'd freeze to death. So he always had to keep her awake. Another thing that Laura was struggling with is she was having a really tough time trying to get the students to pay attention to her because she was young herself and she's never been an authority figure before, so she wasn't really used to keeping people in line. So Ma, she was a school teacher before she married Pa, so she had a lot of wisdom, and she gave Laura a lot of advice on how to get the kids to straighten up and listen to her. And Laura took her advice, and it helped her with the struggles that she was facing with being a teacher. The school contract was just a short 2 months, but it felt like a very long time for Laura because of the boarding house family. It was very miserable. So, whenever you're miserable, it takes twice as long for anything to pass. But anyway, Lermanzo continued to pick her up and bring her home for the weekends and then take her back for the 2 months. And also, a side note, Lermanzo bred and trained Morgan horses. Catalina here, she is a Morgan, and I was very inspired and started looking into the Morgan horse because of the Little House on the Prairie books. So anyway, it would take 5 hours for a horse to trot 20 miles, and it was a 24-mile round trip. So I'm sure the trips for Lermanzo was at least 5.5, 6 hours every time. Anyway, after the contract with the school was over, Laura moved back home with Ma and Pa on the homestead near the Silver Lake, and Lermanzo, surprise, surprise, started dating Laura, and he would take her sled riding in town, which she absolutely loved. There would also be other young people sled riding for fun in the snow and enjoying themselves. And by spring, he was taking her on buggy rides, showing up his new Morgan horses that he was training because he bred, trained, and sold Morgan horses. And Laura wrote about how wild the horses could be when he would show up to take her on buggy rides. One of the stories that I had read about was how the horses were so wild they would not stand still. They definitely trained horses a lot different back then than people do now, but the horses would not stand still. Lermanzo had to hold the horses with all of his might. He couldn't even get out of the buggy to help Laura into the buggy like a gentleman because the horses would have taken off. So Laura would basically run and jump into the buggy and off they would go as crazy with this brand new team of horses that were being trained to be buggy horses. And Laura also wrote about how Lermanzo had her actually drive one of the teams and how much fun it was. Lermanzo and Laura continued to date all through spring and early summer. And that is where I am going to end today's story of the Little House on the Prairie. I will continue on next week, where I will talk about what happens to Ma and Pa when Ma puts her foot down because she gets tired of trying to make things work and she wants to be settled and comfortable. And then I will go into the future of Lermanzo and Laura and their marriage. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will talk to you again next time. Bye!